Our CMC annual meeting topic is the evolution of people, place, parties, and politics in Ohio. Sounds like a great white paper, doesn't it? But instead tonight, we're going to make this an entertaining and stimulating discussion for all of you. And so your forum flyer has an introduction for each of our panelists, and so we'll get right to it here. First up, we have the chair of the Franklin County Republican Party, Mr. Doug Preisse. Round of applause, please. Doug, welcome. Select a chair. Yep, that'd be great. Next up, we have the Distinguished Professor of Social and Behavioral Sciences at The Ohio State University, Mr. Paul Beck. Paul, come on forward. We have a moderator for our discussion. I think most of you will recognize our moderator as the co-anchor at NBC4 and host of the popular public affairs program, The Spectrum, but she's also a senior attorney at Porter Wright. Now, I'm not sure what's right about the word senior attorney, but we love Colleen, and we're happy to have Colleen Marshall here to serve as our moderator. And lastly, the Columbus Metropolitan Club is indeed honored to present a man who has devoted most of his professional career to public service in the state of Ohio. He entered politics in 1970, joining the Ohio House of Representatives, where he served 2 terms, followed by a time as lieutenant governor. There was an unsuccessful run to unseat Jim Rhodes in 1978, but that led to a Jimmy Carter appointment to head the Peace Corps. After 3 years with the Peace Corps in 1982, he again made a successful run for governor and served as Ohio's 64th governor from 1983 to 1991. He is certainly known for many successful endeavors that here in Central Ohio as well as throughout the country, and we in this room know him best as the Honorable Governor Richard Celeste. Please welcome Governor Celeste to the podium.
Well, welcome everyone, and we certainly hope we can give you a stimulating conversation, especially when we have these 3 diverse political minds with us for the evening. I want to start out by asking each of you, you are all veterans of the political world, certainly. Each of you to take about a minute and just reflect as you look at the current political climate, the partisanship, the stagnation that we sometimes see on Capitol Hill and at the State House to a certain extent, to just reflect on where you think politics stands today. And we're going to start with you, Governor.
Well, it isn't where it was back in 1982 or 83 or 84. I mean, then reach across the aisle and count on engagement with political opponents focused on what the state needed to get done. I remember when we first had to deal with a budget deficit. It was Jim Rhodes' budget director, Howard Collier, who helped us shape my first budget and then spoke on its behalf to members of the legislature. A former Republican budget director helping a Democratic governor probably wouldn't happen today. And I think, we pay a price for that. So I find today's political divisions frustrating.
And Doug, you are certainly in the mix as the head of the Franklin County Republican Party. You know, as you look at the current culture and climate of politics in Ohio, you know, what are your thoughts on where we are and where we've been to get to this point? Because I know you're kind of a student of history and how we got to the climate that we're at today.
Well, the governor's experience goes back a little farther than mine, but mine does go back about 34 years in Columbus in direct political activity, although, to your point, Colleen, I did kind of do a little reflection about Ohio and the rough and tumble politics that Ohio is, and I think always has been, carved out of the Northwest Territory and became a state in 1802, and boy, all of the 19th century was boomtown, frontier, and booming cities, with the rough and tumble politics and people that followed. And they used to say if you could make it in statewide politics in Ohio, you could make it nationally because of that rough and tumble, the give and take, and the ferocity that politics has been and I think still is. Perhaps a little more civility in the past after Election Day, I kind of blame, as certainly others have before me, this 24-hour news cycle and modern communications and what's at stake with the size of government and the importance of government, state government these days. But we do have a history going back all the way to presidential politics. Between 1840 and 1920, Ohio sent eight presidents to the White House. And maybe Ohio isn't what it was on the national stage before, but I still think you can make it in that rough and tumble here. You can make it. One final thought, sometimes I think that because we're in it, with respect to the governor's reflections too, but sometimes I think because we're in it in the moment, it seems the most ferocious. We turn the pages of the history books and look at the vitriol between the politicians and the office holders of 50 years ago, 100, 200 years ago. It's pretty nasty. It hurts more when we feel it today than it does reading it in a book, but I think it's always been there to a degree.
To your point, I'm reading Bully Pulpit now by Doris Kearns Goodwin, and it reflects on Roosevelt and Taft around the turn of the century, and certainly they were progressive Republicans at that time. But Paul, from your perspective, I know you always kind of look at it from the global perspective of what's going on in politics. Are we seeing more division than we had maybe 20, 30, 50 years ago?
I think we're in a hyper-polarized period. We have been before. If you think about the period after the Civil War into the early 1900s in Ohio as well as other states, there was incredible polarization at that time as well. We know more about it now because it's much more visible. And I think the other thing about it is that right now it is paralyzing as well. We're in an era of kind of gotcha politics with political leaders, I think, afraid to make hard decisions about things. Of course, we face no hard problems, so it's a wonderful period to be in. But the thing about hard problems is that the only way that these problems really can get resolved is through bipartisan buy-in. They have to share the blame for making hard decisions. And we're not at that period right now, unfortunately, and I think it'll probably continue for some time. The other thing about our politics today is that it's hyper-competitive. I think even more so than in the past, in that the competition now has spilled well beyond the direct political arena. We have all kinds of players now in politics who look a lot like parties in campaigns, but are spending money independently with no control over that money, how it's raised and how it's spent. In fact, one of the ironies of modern day politics is that the parties and the candidates are regulated in terms of how they can raise money and how they can spend it. Nobody else is. And so what we've seen is a flow in Ohio and all across the country of tremendous amounts of money being spent in campaigns, with the gloves kind of taken off because they don't really have to be responsible for what they say about the candidates that they're attacking. And that, I think, is something that is a new development in our politics. The other thing that is, I think, impressive about the present period, and maybe deplorable in some ways, is that despite all this competition, we are in a time where individual parties have come to dominate most of our states. So there's a lot of competition across the country. There is much less competition within the 50 states that make up the country. This is not a good thing for democratic politics. Competition is what makes democracy work. And if you have a situation where there isn't competition, you have real problems. And what you see happening, you see it in a number of states, you see it among Democrats and Republicans, you see it in Ohio, is that the extremes begin to dominate. And I think we're seeing that now. And again, that's a development that we haven't seen for some time. We tend to think of the politics that I certainly grew up in, and maybe many of you did as well, as a time of bipartisanship. It was the Eisenhower era. It was the early 1960s. That really was a rare period of American politics.
Well,
most of American politics has been very
as
turbulent.
you talk about that, and of course we've seen in Ohio, both parties had their seasons where they were in control and gerrymandered the district boundaries. And we are a purple state, but it's not reflected that way by the way, and maybe you can reflect on this, Governor, by the way we separate these districts.
I think I was going to pick up on a couple of Paul's points. I think one of the things that's changed has been the importance of money and the need for very large sums of money to campaign effectively. If you're running for Congress today, you're spending far more money than was being spent 20 or 30 years ago, and the time spent raising that is a distraction from the main business of governing. And when you divorce the money spent in disclosure of who's spending it, I think you invite more extreme positions being taken. A second change in the last 30 years has been term limits. And I personally feel that term limits have had a very negative impact on our politics. If people can only expect to be in office for 8 years, within 4 years they're already asking, what am I going to run for next? And I think it diminishes the courage of a politician who has to think about what is the consequence of what I'm doing today for what I might want to be doing 2 years or 4 years down the road. So my own feeling is that the kind of unlimited expenditures and term limits have had a negative effect. Congressional districting and gerrymandering has been a historic tradition in our country, but it's a pernicious tradition when you begin to create only safe districts, because in an ideal world, every congressional district would be competitive. In an ideal world, it wouldn't be simply the party primary that determines who's going to sit in Washington on our behalf, but it would be a real competition in the fall. So, you know, if I were to wave a magic wand, I would love to see serious efforts to draw congressional districts that are all competitive as part of this too.
Don't we also see with the gerrymandering and with this, you know, the primary becomes the election in a sense. And it also gives more power, don't you think, to the extremes of either party who happens to be in power in that particular district, because there are politicians, and I'll just point to Ted Cruz as an example. There is no incentive for him to be a compromising statesman, because his identity and his political power is formed by his partisanship. And it's not just Republicans, but I'm going to put this to you because we associate the Tea Party with the Republicans.
Thank you.
So here you go, Doug. Why are you guys screwing everything up?
I associate
I'm just kidding.
this audience,
I'm just kidding.
I associate the Tea Party with the harbor and the tea. The thing about the Tea Party is, of course, it's not a party at all, and so the nomenclature kind of gets screwed up. It used to be said 30 years ago that the primary, you run to the right if you're a Republican, you run to the left if you're a Democrat, and then it's a mad dash back for the middle to go after the middle voters. There is less of that when we have these polarized districts. So the governor and I agree, let's extend term limits, which may get me into trouble. And I also think, you know, the consequences of the post-Watergate reforms against the parties, important as they may have been at the time, we reflect now with these less or unregulated entities out there at all. Let's perhaps return to transparent parties where people know who they're contributing to, and it's on the front page of the paper and in the front of your computer when you wake up in the morning, who's spending what on whom. I'd like to see a return to that transparency as well. There are other complications too. Gerrymandering, I appreciate the governor says it goes back on both sides. Kind of, you know, I don't carry the statistics around, but it's also a question of demographics. In 1910, about 35% of people in Ohio lived in cities. Now 82% of folks live in the metropolitan area, so there's that concentration of population too that makes the drawing of districts kind of complicated.
And yet agriculture is still the #1 industry in this state. And one thing that I know different presidential politicians that I have covered that I think, and this is the case with Mitt Romney, really understand that Ohio is kind of what Terry Casey has called a collection of city-states. You've got the industrial Northeast, you've got Appalachian Southeast, you've got, of course, this metro area here in central Ohio that's a high-tech now, heavily educated, you know, just a completely different atmosphere in Toledo, a different, you know, conservative Cincinnati. This is a very difficult state to be a statewide candidate on, let alone to come into this state and not have any history here.
Come on, it's a great state to be a
But
statewide candidate.
Okay, maybe you can, why do you think that?
Mark Twain described Ohio. He said, Ohio is the furthest west of the east and the furthest east of the west. It is the furthest north of the south and the furthest south of the north. I mean, and John Glenn sort of picked up on that. And at one point I heard him say, you know, if you took the United States and squeezed it and squeezed it and squeezed it, you come up with Ohio, right? I mean, there's a sense in which a national candidate should feel totally at home in Ohio because it's everything in the country in one place. And maybe that's a challenge if you're a candidate who likes to talk one way in the South and another way in the North, because it's pretty hard to do in Ohio because they're going to cover you in Cincinnati and they're going to hear about it in Toledo or they're going to hear about it in Cleveland. You can't do that. It's a challenging state, but it's a wonderful state to campaign in.
Well, I'm going to switch topics just because I want to make sure we get to this. And I want to remind all of you, too, coming up at the end of our discussion, we will have a chance for questions. But let's reflect on some current events and take a look at the gubernatorial election right now here in the state of Ohio. And I think we can all agree that there has been an implosion of the Ed Fitzgerald campaign. Unlike one that I've been covering politics, I hate to say it, more than 35 years. And I've never seen anything quite like this. And I've had people say, well, they sure didn't vet him very well. They weren't prepared for this, or they knew this was coming and they didn't know how to crisis manage what was on the way. But, the woman in the car incident kind of rolled out first, and we were all, as from a reporter's perspective, we were all like, okay, well, he said he was lost in his hometown, and he was pulled over for directions or whatever that was. But then, as soon as it came out that he did not have a driver's license for 10 years, is this bad vetting on the part of the Democratic Party? Is it, and what does this mean for the party? And then we'll talk a little bit about down ticket. But let's talk first about, how did this happen? And Governor Celeste, I'm going to go to you first.
Well,
Can you envision a time that this wouldn't happen?
Time out. I've lived in Colorado for the last 12 years. That's also a purple state.
You have a brother who's talking to you all the time. Don't give me that.
We don't talk about this. Let me say, I think the notion that I don't want to get into the details of the Fitzgerald campaign because I honestly don't know, but I don't believe any gubernatorial campaign implodes if people stay focused on the issues and the question of who addresses the issues in a way that they feel most comfortable with. And there are serious issues, and I'm sure that that's the debate that John Kasich would welcome. It has to do with the success of his 4 years, his ability to articulate where he wants to go the next 4 years, and people who want to see an alternative in the state of Ohio that's thoughtful. So I think it's easy, and this is part of the 24-hour news cycle and the rest, it's easy to get totally taken up by an issue of personal responsibility, whatever it might be. And for some people, that's a make or break issue in terms of who they're going to support. For others, they're going to say, where does Fitzgerald stand on education, or where does he stand on economic development, or where does he stand on any one of 4 or 5 other issues, and am I aligned there? And I think, frankly, if I were advising the current governor's campaign, I would say don't take anything for granted. Because when I look around, I think the big issue is do people support the incumbent regardless of party, or are people willing to do what they did to Eric Cantor in a primary? Totally unexpected. And I think that more and more you're going to see, and this goes back to frustration with politics, that there's a demographic here of folks who are fed up with what they see as partisan stalemate and irrelevant issues and things of that kind. So then,
Well, Paul, I'll ask you then, from a professorial standpoint, as you look at the way this all played out, what we're hearing from voters is if he can't manage to get a license, if he can't manage the minutia of his personal life, how can he run a state the size of Ohio? And I think there was just a credibility factor, and it's just such a bizarre thing to go 10 years without your driver's. How did he fly? How did he get on a plane? But, so just give us your perspective.
Well, of course, these things would never happen in the academic world, so I have no experience.
Luckily, there are no scandals at OSU that these
Never, not a one. I guess a couple of things. One is that I think this was going to be a difficult campaign for a Democratic nominee to begin with. It's hard to beat an incumbent governor. It's hard to beat an incumbent Republican governor in Ohio. It's hard to beat somebody who can pull in so much campaign money, both in terms of raising it in his own campaign, but also outside money that is coming in to the state. So a lot had to be going for Fitzgerald for him to mount an effective competition to Governor Kasich. There were problems along the way. Was it poor vetting? I'm never sure that the party really is responsible for poor vetting. I think we rely on candidates to disclose to us the kinds of things that are going to be problems for them. And I'm guessing he didn't disclose these things. They're minor things in a way, but they're minor things that I think impugn a character that was supposed to be the strong suit of his campaign. And so they undercut him more than they would for a candidate that we were kind of suspicious of in terms of standing and character to begin with. But he's somebody who was, well known for his FBI period. He came into the Cleveland position, the one that he's in right now, and really cleaned up a lot of Cleveland politics. These are all good things. That was what he had going for him going forward. And he's pretty much lost that. The campaign is, I think totally disabled right now. It's unfortunate because, to come back to something I said before, competition for us as believers and citizens in a democracy is very important. And it's very important even for the people who win, because they kind of hone their ability to communicate with the public in a competitive race. And that's not going to happen at the gubernatorial level, and that's unfortunate.
I would think that the governor even would have welcomed the opportunity to discuss some issues and some of the successes of his administration in some kind of a forum that required input. I mean, there's no incentive for him to debate.
I mean, we're talking about a governor, much like this governor, and Governor Kasich, who thrives on debate and rough and tumble. Early, 5 or 6 years ago, when some of us were getting ready to help him, we took a off-the-record road trip to suburban Pittsburgh, where he grew up, to kind of learn. And those people don't talk to you, they argue. And so, I mean, that kind of communication, that engaged debate, and that's what he brings, a spirited kind of politics. So I just agree with most of what Paul said, but the part, and I wore my bipartisan tie here. There's a little elephant and a little a donkey sharing a drink.
A stiff drink,
a stiff drink. But I can't at least touch on this a little bit. 5 years ago, when we were moving around the state with John Kasich, who had never run statewide before, we used to say you had to run statewide and lose and then come back. That was for a long time the trend. Ted Strickland proved that wrong. But we'd say, Ted Strickland, it's hard to beat an incumbent governor. Hadn't been done in 36 years, but let me tell you why we think that the record of that executive was such that Kasich could assail it and prevail, and he did. So I just want to say that he was gearing up. We think he's got a great record to take on a tough campaign. As Governor Rhodes used to say, if you're breathing, you're running. So Ed Fitzgerald's not out of this thing, but his campaign is running on fumes. It's difficult practically to see how he gets back off the mat. But things change in politics. You don't take anything for granted. And your advice is well taken, Governor. You run. You don't stop at the 2-yard line. You run through the goal.
But as we look at this and what happens, and we know it's the off-year election anyway, and certainly Ed Fitzgerald is not going to motivate the base to get out to the polls. And so what really might be the ultimate fallout of the implosion, or whatever you want to call it, of his campaign is the down-ticket races, where there were some really, there was a chance to see some competitive politicking going on. We had Connie Pillage going up against Josh Mandel, who, people were saying that could be a close race. We had David Pepper going up against Mike DeWine. David Pepper has some tickets he might have to pay off before he makes a name for himself. But certainly John Carney against Dave Yost here in the auditor's race. There was a chance to have some races that could be competitive and meaningful, and to give voters the opportunity to really look at what the two parties are offering in various statewide offices. Can we think that now that's not going to happen, that we're not going to see that kind of competition that maybe the voters deserve?
Colleen, it depends on, voter attitudes. It depends on newspaper endorsements. It depends on how people frame campaigns. In 1988, Howard Metzenbaum and George Herbert Walker Bush were both running at the same time. And George Bush carried Ohio with 59–60% of the vote. In that same election, Howard Metzenbaum got 57% of the vote. I mean, you think about that swing, people who voted for George Bush and then voted for Howard Metzenbaum, they had a reason for splitting their tickets. And so I think that Ohio still has that frame of mind, and whether anyone down ticket can motivate and organize and communicate effectively in order to accomplish that remains to be seen. But again, I guess from a partisan standpoint, I hope some of them go to sleep at the wheel, because it may give folks a chance. But don't take anything for granted if you're an incumbent. That would be my advice this year. Don't take anything for granted if you're an incumbent.
What do you think about that, Paul? The down ticket races, is it something we should reasonably expect people to see competition in?
I think we should, but I think there is a turnout issue that Democrats face right now. When the top of the ticket is weak, you do worry about motivating voters to vote for the people who are running for statewide office farther down the ticket. But there's another factor here, and I think it's received very little attention, and that is that American voters are in a very surly mood. The only party they like less than the Democratic Party is the Republican Party, and the two are running kind of nip and tuck there. And one could imagine that many voters will say, well, okay, there's no contest really at the gubernatorial level, so I'm going to vote for John Kasich. I may not like it, but there really is not an alternative for him. A lot of voters may think that way. On the other hand, do I want the Republican Party running everything? And the answer to many voters, I think, is going to be, well, that scares me too. We'll see what happens. It's hard in early September to make a projection. The polls are out there. They're not telling us that story, although they are telling us the story about surly voters and politicians being held in very low esteem among voters. And there's a possibility, I think, that mood could really take effect as we get closer to Election Day. And for the political scientist in me, that would be a really interesting thing to see.
It's a fascinating academic perspective, which I respect. The practical perspective on the ground is that on Election Day, nobody wakes up and says, Gladys, get up, we got to go vote for the Auditor of State today. Yeah. It just doesn't usually happen. Sometimes it happens, but there's extraneous circumstances that would cause the down ticket races to have much of a chance. Some good people run on both sides, so we'll see how it plays out. But history would suggest that what it looks like, while taking nothing for granted, it probably is good for the incumbents, despite that surliness, I think mostly directed towards Washington, I think.
I don't know about that. Certainly my surliness is directed particularly toward Washington, but Colleen, historically, I was the last person to run for lieutenant governor, independent of the governor. We weren't a team, and Jack Gilligan lost and I won.
I forgot about that.
Something happened there. Now, in the down ticket, but I won by 90,000 votes. Jack lost by 12,000 votes. That's there's some. It's not necessarily getting out to vote for the auditor. It's people who say, you know what? Well, what you said. I don't know. I don't feel comfortable voting a straight ticket here. And so that'll be the interesting thing, I think, to see whether there's a substantial difference in the vote for governor and for the down.
You also have to wonder, as people look at the results coming up in November, that John Kasich, of course, this is the time when they're talking about presidential politics in 2016. If John Kasich, with this race, you would think he would have a sweeping win. Is there a certain margin that he has to have, a respectable margin against Ed Fitzgerald, that will make him look more presidentially attractive? Or, you know, if this is a narrow race, won't his critics say, well, look, he couldn't even beat this guy who couldn't run a campaign?
The critics, if he wins by 50% plus one, will say he almost lost, and if he wins by a landslide, will say he had no competition. And it doesn't matter whether it's a Republican or a Democrat. The critics are going to throw that at him. Fundamentally, if you don't win statewide, you're out of the national scene, and if you do win, theoretically, you're still in it. And I mean, for a long, long, long time, if you're a United States Senator of either party or a governor of Ohio, you're going to get talked about around the country because of the importance of this 7th largest state that is the epicenter of presidential politics in the modern time.
And certainly Rob Portman seems to be positioning himself to be considered for the presidential ticket as well. But I covered an event with Governor Kasich last week in which he talked quite openly about the Medicaid expansion and about some of the stances that he's taken that were maybe in opposition to what we expect a Republican to do. And there was speculation among all the reporters, wow, that's sounding very presidential campaignish because we all think that's going to be coming. Is that what the two, I mean, is anybody willing to make a prediction here? Go ahead, Governor Celeste.
I'll set up the governor by saying I hear John Kasich talking about Medicaid expansion and initiatives and drug interdiction and initiatives in mental health. It sounds like 1983 all over again, the mental health stuff, which you pioneered, and thanks for that. But honest to goodness, well, I'll leave it at that.
Well, people who knew John Kasich back when he was in the Senate said he was running for president.
He did once.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that that's news to anyone. Whether he'll be an effective candidate depends. But I mean, look, the Republican convention is going to be in Cleveland, Ohio. Yeah. You know, there are things that would play in his favor, and certainly a runaway victory in Ohio would help. But you know, again, so many things can happen. 2 months is a long time in a campaign. 2 years plus 2 months is a very long time in a campaign. So I don't want to jinx him by making any predictions.
And do you think this, you know, we've talked about this before. He mentioned Cleveland. I've got to ask you this. What do you think the chances are of Columbus, and Mayor Coleman really gave that big push to get the Democratic convention here? We've never seen where one state hosted both major political party conventions.
It's time.
Do you think it's going to happen?
I would hope it would happen. I'm not an insider, so I have no idea what they're talking about. I don't see Phoenix as a possibility for the Democrats, given immigration issues.
Right.
Philadelphia probably is the competitor there. I don't know.
I was an insider, but I'm not anymore. But I tell you what, it was really a neat experience to sit next to Michael Coleman, John O'Grady, and some of our other community representatives addressing the RNC. Of course, we're ribbing each other a little bit. We put together a great plan, and we didn't get it. I think that the local Democrats and those of us from Central Ohio would think it would be great to have the DNC here. First time since 1968 that a state had both conventions. That was Florida. First time since 1936, I think, that Cleveland will have a convention. And wouldn't it be great if we had one in Columbus, too? We can agree on all that.
Mm-hmm. It really would. And Governor, I have to ask you, look, somebody who's saying, I have to ask you, because other people have said to me, do you think he misses it? Do you think he misses politics, misses being in the mix of things? And especially in the year or two after you left Ohio, did you look back and say, what are they doing? You know, what, did you second guess? Did you want to come back and still have your finger in the pie?
No. My brother was taking care of Ohio. I was out in Colorado. I loved my experience in public life, Colleen. It was a privilege. I loved winning. I loved losing. I mean, I loved the experience of going out and engaging with people and putting together constituencies around mental health issue or other issues where we could make a difference. I didn't do everything right, or I didn't do everything as well as I would have liked. But boy, did I have a terrific time, and I'm proud of what we accomplished. When I moved on, I moved on. I didn't spend time saying, gee, if somebody asked me, I would have had really good advice for how they could do it better. I care about what happens in Ohio very deeply still, because 4 of my children live here. I have grandchildren here. My brother, my sister, you know, this is home in many ways. But I'm glad that somebody else is now dealing with these issues. I am working on a book, which I hope will celebrate the privilege of public service and the opportunities that I had, not only in Ohio, but serving as director of the Peace Corps and serving as ambassador to India. I would like to convey some of the real personal feeling that you get in that kind of tough exchange where you have a candid conversation. When I came to the legislature, the Republicans controlled the House. And so we had nothing to do. I could stand up and I wouldn't even get recognized on the floor by Charlie Kerfus, right? But after it was over, after the committee hearings were over, I would go across the street to the Neal House Bar and I would sit with Lloyd George Kearns from Marion, Ohio, and Carlton Davidson from Ironton, Ohio, 2 Republican legislators, and nurse one beer for an hour and a half or 2 hours, and I'd learn more about the legislative process, more about the relationships of people in the legislature, and they were wonderful. And when I decided to run statewide, I got down to, you know, I was down in Ironton, and Carlton said, "I'll take you around the courthouse. I'll introduce you to people." Well, he's a Democrat, but you know, he's a good Democrat. You know? When it was all over, he said, "Come on, Dick, I want you to see my birds." He had fighting cocks in his backyard that he would take across the river to Kentucky because it was illegal in Ohio, but it was okay in Kentucky. I mean, now, where else can you get that experience? You know? You've got to love running in a state like Ohio and having that kind of experience.
Okay, is it question time already? All right, that's too bad. I had more, but we're going to move on because I know you all have some great questions. So we will invite you, if you do have a question, to make your way to the center of the room and queue up kind of behind the microphone. Introduce yourself, and we will be happy to entertain your questions.
My name's Fred Looper. I hear expression that all politics is local. And I haven't heard you talk about the Fitzgerald debacle and how it's going to affect Franklin County. Let's say in a judicial race, for example. What do you think is going to happen in Franklin County, if anything, as a result of that?
Well, Fred, I think you're directing that to me. The governor appointed your lovely daughter to the bench, and she's got a tough race. We live in a modern urban county, which means just about anywhere in the country. A phenomenon has taken place here as it has everywhere else. We live in a base Democratic county, and it's an uphill battle for us, the local Republicans, but I like to remind folks that in that mosaic that is the statewide election, we're the most important county because we send more votes to the top of the ticket, Republican top of the ticket, president, governor, than any other county. We'll probably be the biggest county at the next census, larger finally than Cuyahoga County. Nonetheless, carrying the county outright for local candidates, there's no D or R on the judicial ballot. It's tough. You know, and we have spirited campaigns with our friends across the aisle, and we talk about it quite often. We inherited from Joanne Davidson and Mike Colley, I think, a pretty good tradition of finding the very best men and women who will make a sacrifice. Most of these judges are making a lot less money than they could in private sector. And they work their hearts out, and they win some and they lose some, and I loved what the governor said, because, you know, if you lose, you come back stronger. It happened to him, and he was chief executive of the 7th largest state for 8 years. So we just tell our candidates to work their hearts out because they have to. It's an uphill battle. Turnout should be better for us this year, but carrying the county outright is still tough for Republicans.
Want to come forward?
Yes, thank you. My name is John McKnight, and I'm just endlessly amused by a lot of the things that have been going on in politics in the last few years that are serious things, but things like Fitzgerald's not having a driver's license for 10 years. The story about Mitt Romney strapping a dog to the roof of his car. I mean, the list goes on for a while. Governor Christie's cabinet deliberately causing a traffic jam, and I've got a bunch of them written down here. Are those things, have they been going on forever, or is this a reflection of the divisiveness of today's politics, and I'm just, you know, just now noticing it?
I shouldn't talk so much. You know, I remember, and I wasn't old enough, but neither was anybody in the room, but you read our history books when the Republicans accused President Roosevelt of sending a battleship back for his little dog, Fala. And of course, this kind of thing's been going on forever, and I think we need to try to do the best we can to educate ourselves and our neighbors and friends to filter out the less important issues and focus on the more important.
Governor, tell us
And a
about
good
some of
and a
your
good
scandals.
politician knows how to take advantage of it, because Franklin Roosevelt gave a Labor Day speech shortly after the episode about Fallon, in which he said, "They've criticized me, they've criticized Eleanor, why, they've even criticized my little dog Fallon," and brought the house down, right? So, and part of it is, how do you deal with these things, right? And I think, you know, this comment, the 24/7 news cycle has a kind of pernicious aspect to it, because it becomes hard to stay focused on something serious and substantive for a long time, so you have to find something to fill in with. And what you fill in with is the dog strapped to the roof, or the, you know, the non-existent driver's license. Anyway, that's my thought. I think this has probably gone on for a very long time, but we didn't have, you know, Huffington Post or Politico or whoever it was who would pull something out of the hat, or the Drudge Report, right? So,
It's a new day, isn't it, Paul?
Yeah, I would echo that thought. I think these things have gone on ever since politics began, hundreds and thousands of years ago. We know more about it now, and the ability of the opposition to research an opposing candidate is much higher than it used to be. When I was in Colorado, like the governor, when I heard about the Fitzgerald situation, and I thought, you know, I got that parking ticket back in '92. Do you think it's still on my record? And the answer is, it probably is. And if I were running for statewide office, and I'm not running for statewide office, somebody would find it and embarrass me with it. So I think you know, we're better able, you know, any of us can do that. If you pay $25, you can look into somebody's public records and find these kinds of things. You have to know what you're looking for, it seems to me, and I suspect there were some leaks somewhere about what people ought to be looking for, but it was there to be found, and then it becomes, of course, very embarrassing to a candidate.
Your question?
I'm Don Hollister, Director of the Ohio League of Conservation Voters, and although I work for a bipartisan board, I find myself advocating for what are often viewed as Democrat issues. I spent considerable time going to Republican leaders asking what happened. Many of the milestones in conservation history or legislation was under Republican presidents. And I didn't get a clear answer. There were various, you know, a range of explanations. And I ask you folks, why isn't clean air and clean water a bipartisan issue?
Who wants to handle that one?
Of course it is. Of course it should be. I'll point out that this current Republican governor vetoed the Lake Erie bill because he didn't think it was strong enough. To the great consternation of the Republican majority, which passed it, particularly the House, they came back and improved it somewhat, I think, perhaps not perfect, but improved. So we got to take them, you know, one at a time, and love to see great. You know, I'm an old-fashioned Teddy Roosevelt conservative, conserve. I can only speak for myself on that, and then this one incident that I can point to with the current governor showed some leadership on.
Don, I don't know. I mean, I can't answer for the Republican Party, certainly, but I think one of the things that has happened is an even deeper concern, and that is a skepticism about science that's reflected in the debate around climate change. And if you were to ask me what worries me about the quality of our public conversation around this, I think there are certain things where there should be a real consensus. And the issue of climate change, I think, is one. And taken aback by the number of people who question the preponderant evidence of science in a matter of this kind. And I worry about what those consequences might be over the long term as we try to deal with an issue that isn't simply a state issue or even a national issue, but a global issue and one of vital importance to our future generations.
I think also and connected with this, we're in an era of great distrust of authorities. And so if an authority speaks on a particular issue, people are often very skeptical about what that authority says. I think it's a real problem. Part of what politics should be about is generating public support for difficult decisions. This is not an era where you can generate public support for much of anything, left or right. And I think that's very problematic because the world goes on without us dealing with these issues. And in some cases, we may reach a point where we've gone too far to be able to correct things. But you see it with Common Core, same kind of issue. You see it, I think, with these issues of climate change in the environment. You see it in a whole host of ways. You see it in foreign policy. Very skeptical public about what the authorities say about most anything. And as somebody in the classroom where I try to be an authority on things, I don't like this very well.
Yeah.
Hello, my name is Jeremiah Kimball. I'm the district executive, Capital City District Executive for the Boy Scouts of America here in the St. McCain Council. I hear about public support and motivation of voters. So can you tell me some of the techniques that you would use or that you did use to motivate voters to support these issues or support the candidates?
That sounds like a gubernatorial question.
You know, Jeremiah, it's interesting. The Boy Scouts, the first campaign I ran, first office I ran for was state representative. And the beauty of the state legislative district is it's manageable. I determined that I was going to knock on, or my campaign was going to knock on every door. And we recruited youngsters from junior high school to work on the campaign. Basically, the kids who babysat for my children, my younger children, became the core of our volunteers for that state rep race. And we probably, in the end, had 40 or 50 junior high students who had arranged to get a day off on election day so that they could work polling places. The problem was that the superintendent of schools in the district didn't know they'd gotten permission, so the truant officer started picking them up. But it was, these young people really became engaged in the process even long before they could vote. This was before the 18-year-old vote, so that the prospect for them voting was waiting until they were 21. But at 14 or 15, they were deeply engaged. And after I won that race, I had at least 2 of these young people call me around specific issues that they expected me, as the state legislator they'd helped to elect, they wanted to know what I was going to do about these issues. So I think the earlier we can engage young, individuals in the political process, the better it is. And they won't always agree with you. They'll challenge you along the way, and I think that's healthy. And the more we can encourage that, the better I think the system will be.
And your question?
Hi, I'm Kathy Fox. Governor, I'm wondering if you would be willing to share with us what you think you're most proud of from your 8 years as governor, and to Chairman Preisse and Professor Beck, what do you think Governor Celeste should be most proud of?
Yep, other than getting 2 terms in office. I think probably there was a moment when I absolutely knew, Kathy, why I had been elected governor. And it was maybe the loneliest moment in my life. It was probably 3:30 in the morning in March of 1985. Home State Savings and Loan had closed and lost about $30 million, most of it Marvin Warner's money. And there was a run on 5 other savings and loans and a threat of more to follow. And I had had a conversation at 3 in the morning with Paul Volcker, who was then head of the Federal Reserve. And I had in fact, it's interesting, in my office, I had invited 3 of my most trusted advisors, Frank Celeste, my father, who had grown up in the real estate business, Jack Kessler, who was a member of the Federal Reserve Board in Cleveland, and Don Shackelford from here in Columbus, Ohio, really knowledgeable savings and loan executive. And the 3 of them sat there while I talked to Paul Volcker outlining the options. And Chairman Volcker said, well, I'm going to tell you the pluses and minuses on each. I'm not going to recommend a course of action. You know, one was to let the run continue, another was to try to limit how much a depositor could take out each month, and the third was to sign an executive order, close them, and force them to get federal insurance. And I went through each of these options. None of them were very good. He said in the end, whatever you do is going to cost you at least $250 million and take 2 years to get done. Now, we didn't have $250 million. We'd had a terrible problem balancing our budget. We'd raised taxes, as everybody knew, and that wasn't popular. And the re-election campaign was 1.5 years long. So I turned to my 3 wise men, and I said, what do you recommend? And he said, well, you're going to have to live with this decision, so we think you should make a decision you can live with. So I excused them from the office, and I sat there and pondered for about 20 minutes and thought about what Franklin Roosevelt must have thought about when he was faced with a banking crisis during the New Deal. And I realized there's nobody in this state who can make this decision except me. I have to make a decision. I have to make a decision tonight, and I have to live with it. And in my mind, the question I asked was, what can I do that will best protect the depositors at these 60 institutions? It was 500,000 Ohioans, $5 billion of deposits were at stake. And I decided I'm going to sign the executive order and close them. I called everybody in and said, this is my decision, write the executive order. An hour later, Jan Allen came back in. She'd been working with our pro bono counsel who told us that we had these 3 options. And she said, Governor, there's a problem. I said, what's the problem? She said, our lawyers think you don't have the authority to sign this executive order. I said, wait a minute. On Monday, I had this authority, right? Yes. On Tuesday, I had this authority. Yes. On Wednesday, I had this authority. Yes. Yesterday, when I was getting ready to talk to Chairman Volcker, they told me I had this authority. She said, yes. And I said, now at 5 in the morning, they say I don't have it. She said, yes. I said, you tell them, write that goddamn executive order and be prepared to defend it in court at 9. And we signed that executive order, and not a single institution took us to court because we were protecting them. They didn't want to tell their depositors this, but we were protecting them. And we resolved the whole matter in 6 months and with $110 million, every penny of which the state got back. And that, I mean, as federal taxpayers, we spent $60 billion to bail out savings and loan and didn't get a penny back. So if you ask me what my proudest moment was, that really was it.
So our final thought from each of you, we'll begin with you.
Yeah, and as good a story as that was and compelling, I was there as a young staffer, and it was scary. We had to lock arms to form a human corridor so the legislators could get on and off the floor. The chambers were packed. People were upset. They couldn't get their money. Fisticuffs broke out downstairs in the rotunda. It was scary, and it was a time for leadership. And you had some good partners in the legislature, but you had to be the governor.
It was bipartisan.
And you were. But again, I'll say something that I said before, because you brought up some issues, mental health, passports, some other things that are part of the conversation today that weren't coming out of the 70s and going into the 80s. So you were a progressive on those issues, and Republicans in years since have embraced those and I think made improvements too. But you started the conversation on some important issues that continue today.
Paul?
I wasn't in Ohio at the time, but I think it was probably the tax increase. Not a popular thing, a thing that cost you politically. On the other hand, it's not something that would be done today, right? Even if there was a feeling that we need more tax revenue, to be able to A, close the deficit, B, provide for infrastructural growth, C, fight foreign wars if we're going to be able to do that sort of thing. So I think it was a very courageous decision and important for Ohio. I followed Ohio long enough to know in the early years that Ohio floated its budget for many years on its bonding authority, and that was not a good thing. And I think there was probably, again, I wasn't here when that decision was made, but probably a good thing to break from that kind of pattern and try to finance state government in a more honest and straightforward fashion and pay the political costs for doing that.
Thank you, Paul, and thanks to each of you. And I will give the final thought on the savings and loan crisis. I was a reporter during that time, so thanks, really good story. Thanks to all of our panelists.
Hey, my daughter's not here.